Thank you, Bruno. Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, it gives me great pleasure to welcome our first keynote speaker of the morning. Some of you may know him, Ben Simpfendorfer. Ben is the managing director of Silk Road Associates and the founder. Prior to Silk Road Associates, Ben was the senior China economist for JP Morgan, and then he went on to become the chief China economist at RBS. I've had the great pleasure of working with Ben over a number of years, working on some really fascinating thought leadership. Ben often speaks at a lot of the different conferences and events, often quoted on the BBC, on CNN. Interestingly enough, he is about to launch his latest book, The Rise of the New East. I'm sure it's going to be a fascinating read, just like his previous book, which was The New Silk Road. Ben is going to share with us some of his thoughts around globalization of sourcing and the impact of new models. I should also note that he speaks a number of different languages: Arabic, Putonghua, English. He's Australian, so he speaks English. He's a very, very smart guy, and I'm sure he's got some great insights to share with us this morning. So again, ladies and gentlemen, please give a very warm French chamber welcome to Ben Simpfendorfer.
Thank you, Anson, for a kind introduction. Thank you also to the French Chamber for the invitation to what is a terrific event and always a highlight, certainly on my calendar. The sourcing industry is central to many of the biggest changes in the global economy. You get to see those changes often months or even years ahead of other businesses. And in fact, the banks would benefit from spending more time looking at your activities than they do trying to glean insights from the regular economic data. And whereas the industry used to be about sourcing cheap product from low-cost countries to sell to affluent consumers, it's increasingly difficult to distinguish between what is a low-cost and high-cost country, and there are affluent consumers in almost all countries in the world. So the result of that, and if there's one message I can leave you with today, and that is that we're seeing growth, but it's more complex growth. So what I thought today is to focus, of course, on China, then to take the analysis out to the rest of Asia, and then to look more broadly at the changes we're seeing in the global economy and what that might mean for your sourcing business over the coming years. Now, China, of course, is central to these changes, so I thought a good place to start, and given that many of us have been in the industry for at least a decade now, is just to recap how far we've come over the last 10 years. So 10 years ago, China was selling 2 million automobiles a year. Minimum wages were just $55 a month in Guangdong province. You could buy an apartment on the outskirts of Shanghai for $50,000, and a Big Mac would cost you just $1.20. Today, the country's selling 12 million automobiles a year. Minimum wages have jumped to $246 a month. That same apartment on Shanghai's outskirts will cost you $230,000, and a Big Mac will cost you $2.74. And I apologize for referring to a Big Mac at a French Chamber event, but it is a universal measure of relative changes in prices. So most of that has come through currency and inflation. The result of a China that is higher cost and that is more affluent has been, as we now well know, ripple effects throughout the sourcing industry. So I thought to capture some of those effects. Asia's share of US imports, and I'm using US imports because they are the easiest standard measure to use for one of the world's largest economies, are already high, averaging near 70% for most products. But we've seen a dramatic change in where the US is importing its products over the last 3 years. So the two columns on the right show the average change or the change in market share between 2003 and 10 versus the change in market share between 2010 and 2013. What you can see is that for most products, Asia's share of US imports has stalled. Non-knitted apparel, knitted apparel, almost flat after recording a 3% increase in market share. More remarkably, footwear is now in decline at 1%. The implication being that countries outside this region, not just China but also Southeast Asia, are beginning to pick up market share. Okay? And so while China's prices might be rising, and we're seeing a relocation of production to the rest of the region, it is really just a relocation of production. We're not seeing the region overall pick up the sorts of market share gains that it has over the previous decade. One reason for that, of course, is China's size. And again, this is a well-known point, but I thought to include one graph that you could share with your colleagues, whether in Europe or the United States, to underscore that point. There are single Chinese provinces that are larger than most Southeast Asian countries. Cambodia's GDP is the same size as the GDP of a suburb of Guangzhou. Vietnam's GDP is not much bigger than that. Vietnam's GDP is not much bigger than Guangdong province itself. So yes, there has been a relocation of production to the rest of Southeast Asia, but it's very difficult for Southeast Asia to increase its market share given its relative scale, small scale compared to China. Let's look at some of those product lines in more details. There's three I wanted to highlight because they tell or they underscore what is a very complex trend. And the reason why that most of us in the room, those of us in the panel sessions today, won't be telling the same story. Everyone that certainly I speak to in the sourcing industry seems to have a bit different view on each country and working with individual companies in those countries. Let's take knitted apparel imports as an example. This is a familiar story. China's market share has stalled, even as Southeast Asia, low-cost countries in Southeast Asia and South Asia pick up market share. No surprise there. In the electronics sector, so again, labor-intensive, but more reliant on component parts, much more complex supply chains, China actually continues to pick up market share, but primarily from North Asia, Korea, and Taiwan. A very divergent trend. Footwear imports is perhaps one of the more fascinating. China has lost significant market share in just 3 years. Vietnam has picked up part of that market share, but the region as a whole is losing out. Italy has been one of the gainers, increasing its market share at 1%, but I would add to that, Spain, Portugal are all increasing market share. So the story of China getting rid of its labor-intensive apparel's processing and gaining more capital-intensive electronics processing trade is a trend that's still with us, but the more complex trend, and one that we're increasingly going to see, is the return of production to higher cost countries, whether because of near sourcing, whether because of a focus of affluent consumers on high quality products, or simply because of the changes we've seen in the global economy over the last decade that has made particularly those southern Mediterranean countries more cost competitive. So again, back to my original point, it's increasingly difficult to distinguish or determine who is low cost, who is high cost. I now want to walk through three big changes that I think will determine or have a significant influence on the sourcing industry over the coming 15 years. They are labor, near sourcing, and global demand. And what I thought to do is to offer some perspective to compare the last 15 years with the coming 15 years. My point being that if we'd held this conference in 2000 and I'd showed the similar graphs, it probably would have provided us with a good indication of what the sourcing industry was in for over those next 15 years. Asia's youth labor shortages are about to worsen. So if you're worried about the fact that youth labor is in increasingly short supply in China, then there's reason to get more worried, because those shortages will only intensify over the coming 15 years. Whereas China lost 79 million youth labor, the youth labor population over the last 15 years. In the next 15 years, it will lose 118 million. Those increases or those decreases are so significant, no other country in the world will be able to pick up the slack. You can see here that the only countries that will see an increase in their youth population are India, Malaysia, and the Philippines, for an aggregate figure of just 10 million workers. So if I was to have looked at this graph 15 years ago, I would have said we would have seen a relocation of production, perhaps from China into India. Given the restraints in that country, we've instead seen the relocation of production from China into Southeast Asia. But again, labor shortages will be a crucial constraint on the continuation of that trend. And in fact, in many countries that we're looking to relocate production to, Myanmar, Thailand, Vietnam, Indonesia, these are all seeing declines in their youth labor population. So let's put that into a global context. Again, Asia's youth population, and this is non-Japan, declined by just 1 million persons over the last decade. It will decline by 143 million persons over the coming 15 years. Okay, so we are, particularly in the labor-intensive sectors, going to be forced to look for other alternatives. There's one obvious alternative on this map, and that is sub-Saharan Africa. An increase of 216 million youth labor over the next 15 years. And I know we have a session later today that does talk about the opportunities in sub-Saharan Africa. And again, and I will have a slide shortly on this point, there are some serious constraints. But nonetheless, if we're looking for big key trends and over a 15-year period, my gut feel is it inevitable that some companies will be looking for alternatives in this part of the world. Second key trend, near sourcing. This is a subject close to my heart. 12 months ago, I was at the SEZ zone in Egypt, just along the Suez Canal, where they're looking to attract significant amounts of Chinese investment, and already have, with the single idea of acting as a processing zone for raw material that is brought through the Suez Canal and then sold on to either Africa or to Europe, given the fact that Egypt enjoys duty-free arrangements with both those two regions. But I wanted to test it and ask myself, is near sourcing actually happening? So let me explain this graph. This compares not the US, but the UK import market share. Again, the change in the share between 2003 and 10, and the change in the share between 2010 and 13. What you can see, and starting with Eastern Europe, is that between 2003 and 10, Eastern Europe's share of UK imports fell, in some cases, significantly during those 7 years. The trend is now reversed. We're actually seeing a small pickup in market share for soft goods, certainly knitted apparel, non-knitted apparel. The increase has been slightly larger for hard goods, furniture. Much the same in Turkey, where we saw very steep gains, declines in soft goods, and we've subsequently seen a pickup over the last 3 years. Apologies, there's something wrong with those graphs. I'll provide you with an update for the figures, but I can guarantee you the figures are almost the same for Turkey. Soft goods have seen an increase, much as hard goods have. North Africa, the trend is slightly different. There's very little hard goods shipped out of the region, but we've seen at least a stabilization in those market share figures. US import market share, Latin America and the Caribbean. Here the pattern is less consistent. Knitted apparel and non-knitted apparel or soft goods saw remarkable declines between 2003 and 2010. Again, we've seen a stabilization of those trends. Not the same pickup that we've seen in either Eastern Europe or Turkey, but nonetheless a stabilization in those trends. Perhaps the one exception in both these graphs is the fact that hard goods or furniture are actually still in decline. There's little benefits there in terms of near sourcing. My third point, consumption. So again, difficult to distinguish between low-cost and high-cost countries, but increasingly we're selling to affluent consumers in most parts of the world. This was global consumption in 2000. Very obvious points to make. Europe, the United States were the world's largest buyers, but Asia, even at that point in time, was already significant. Here's the change today. By 2030, Europe and the United States will still be significant markets, but Asia will have spending power equivalent to that of Europe and the United States combined. For those of us sourcing in this part of the world, our biggest markets will be, potentially, in this part of the world. For those of us dealing with manufacturers in this part of the world, your manufacturers may already be coming to you and saying, we would rather sell to this part of the world. Bigger markets, faster growing markets, markets that we understand better than we do Europe and the United States. There's also some other dynamics worth looking out for, though. Sub-Saharan Africa will still be a very small market in terms of spending power. Now, if you cast your mind back to the figures on demographics, even if we get a relocation of some labor-intensive production to Sub-Saharan Africa, it won't be consumed there. It will be exported, either back to Europe or to the United States, and let's not forget Latin America, which by 2030 itself will be a significant market. So again, we get growth, but more complex growth with supply chains further dispersing in response to changes in the distribution of demand. China, of course, will be at that point the world's largest economy, the world's largest consumer. So it's interesting to ask, where are they already buying their goods from? I certainly bought some clothes from Shanghai Gap, the Shanghai Gap Superstore only recently, 7 items, all of which were made in Indonesia, Bangladesh, Vietnam, and Sri Lanka. So we pulled out the data on China's imports of soft, non-knitted, knitted footwear. You can see that the growth over the last 5 years has been decent. I don't want to call it stellar, but certainly decent. And you can see the increase or the share of imports from other low-cost countries such as Vietnam, Bangladesh, Cambodia, but also high-cost countries, of course, such as Italy, in terms of luxury branded goods. North Korea ranks quite high on at least 2 of these charts, and I was disappointed to see we don't have a panel session on North Korea today as a sourcing alternative for those shipping into China. A quick reference to Africa and whether it is in fact a China plus one option. I'd refer you to what is an excellent piece of work done by the World Bank in 2012. Focuses on light manufacturing in Africa. They sort of did the sort of research that is dear to me. They actually went out and interviewed 300 firms, as well as surveyed another 1,400 firms to identify what are the key issues for those looking to set up in sub-Saharan Africa. 5 key issues. Input industries are a constraint. So sub-Saharan Africa still imposes significant duties on imported raw materials. That's created distortions in the provision of agricultural goods, also the provision of forestry goods, which are obviously key inputs into light manufacturing. It also makes it expensive to import those goods, even for simple processing. Trade logistics, an obvious point, but trade logistics tends to be poor in the region. You find that countries such as Ethiopia, perhaps they produce polo shirts, are often producing just 1,000 pieces per order. Specialty orders where time to market is less important. Access to finance, much as you see in China and other parts of Southeast Asia, very difficult for small to mid-sized firms to borrow money from the banks, either to acquire land or to build factories. And that's part of the reason that there is only limited access to industrial land, very few industrial parks in sub-Saharan Africa, and even when governments do build factories on the outskirts of cities, logistics costs can then become prohibitive in terms of trying to ship your product to that factory. And finally, worker and entrepreneurial skills. The average factory owner, for instance, in Tanzania, only 60% will have a basic education. Those figures are upwards of 90% in countries such as China and Vietnam. So that's not to deter those from looking at sub-Saharan Africa, but these are the sorts of key issues that could be a restraint on that relocation of production. I want to step back a little bit from the sourcing industry and explain some of the changes we're seeing across the region and how they might impact your business. Most important is there's been a fundamental change in Chinese outbound investment. We're starting to see private firms make acquisitions abroad, and the temptation is to always argue that they're building out global platforms. The reality is that most entrepreneurs are saying to themselves, we're looking to make acquisitions of brands and technologies to add value in our home markets. Our home market, 1.3 billion consumers, a GDP growth rate of 8%. It makes sense to stay at home rather than grow abroad. Dalianwan's purchase of AMC Cinemas is a great case in point. China's box office will shortly overtake the box office of the United States. Dalianwan was not looking to build out a global cinema chain, but instead looking to bring back brands and technologies to lock up China's cinema market. Much the same for Bright Foods and its purchase of Weetabix. I'm certain Bright Food doesn't have an ambition to get 1 in 10 of Chinese eating Weetabix every morning for breakfast. But what they are buying into are the processes, the technologies to provide or to produce high quality and secure food for increasingly affluent consumers at home. And Bright Foods is a great case in point, having purchased Australia's Madison Foods just recently, not only to secure the supply of high-quality food, but simply to secure what is Madison's ability to go out and acquire new companies with a very strong mergers and acquisitions team. And so what we're seeing in the food sector, and it's quite pronounced, we are likely and already beginning to see in the retail sector, with manufacturers potentially looking up to buy well-known retail brands in Europe and the United States to bring those brands back into China and to help them make that evolution from manufacturer into brand owner. I thought to throw this slide in because I know we're going to talk about online trends over the rest of the day. But there's a tendency to focus simply on the fact that China's affluent households, or the number of affluent households, has increased significantly from 5 million to 58 million. In terms of those households earning them $15,000 a year. But that's associated with an increase in the urban internet penetration rate from 17% to 16%. So households are more affluent, they're also more likely to be online. And if you were to break down that internet penetration rate for just the population between 20 and 50, it would be upwards of 95%. Okay? So consumers are not only spending more, but they have more access to information. They're comparing product, comparing prices, and they are increasingly sophisticated as a result. And the fact that they are buying online will be a major influence on how we sell goods across the region over the coming 15 years. The reason I say that, and remember that Asia's spending power, Asia, non-Japan Asia, will be equivalent to that of Europe and the United States combined by 2030. But there's a challenge for those multinationals who get excited by these figures. And it's the fact that Asia has 270 cities with populations greater than 750,000. That compares to just 59 in the United States. So the multinationals who made their money in the United States during the 70s, 80s, and 90s were selling to a single market, single currency, single language. The multinationals who want to capture stronger consumer spending in this part of the market will be selling to multiple countries, multiple currencies, multiple languages, and will have to find distribution strategies to sell to 4 times the number of mid-sized cities, cities that don't have legacy assets such as shopping malls. And so the fact that consumers in the region are more affluent, are more online, is just one driver of e-commerce. Multinationals will be the other because it's the only way to get product into so many of these cities. And a nice indication of that is Mothercare. And I'm not sure if they're representatives for the company here in the audience, but Mothercare only recently opened up an online Indonesian store. They, of course, have flagship stores in 46 cities, but they offer delivery to any city in the archipelago, recognizing that you cannot build a store out in every one of Indonesia's mid-sized cities just to capture that top 5% of spenders. The fact you can register online to send gifts to friends and relatives who've just had children. It's this dispersion of spending across multiple cities that will increasingly drive e-commerce and the way we sell product into the region. Finally, if I could just make 2 references to China. And now I'm going to put on my economist hat, but I think these slides are useful. Because I'm sure that you will get questions on what does China's slowing economy mean for our business. And so the question I would put back to your colleagues, whether in Europe or the United States, is which China are you talking about? Okay? And the reason I say that, and let's take debt levels across the country. Clearly you'll have read in the media there's a lot of concern about debt levels. But these ratios or these circles show you debt levels on a city-by-city basis. The obvious point is the cities with larger circles are more leveraged. There's a great dispersion between these cities. So those in the western, southwestern, and even the Yangtze River Delta region, there are cities that are over-leveraged. These are the parts of the country that are about to get themselves into serious trouble. These are the parts of the country that are going to produce the bad debts that we read about in the Wall Street Journal. But there are other parts of the region, such as the parts of the Pearl River Delta, which are less leveraged. So even as China's growth slows to just 6% or below, these are the parts of the country that will find it easier to attract labor, to attract capital, to produce the sort of productivity gains to sustain growth. And I think that's important in terms of how local governments respond to the challenges of slower growth and how they change policies and what that means for our suppliers, our manufacturers. So again, we need to ask our colleagues, which China are you talking about? Are you talking about the China that is the world's 2nd largest economy? Are you talking about the China and those city clusters or the best performing parts of the country that combined have a GDP that is twice the size of Brazil? Because over time you might find that the country rebalances towards those best performing parts of the country. So perhaps if I leave it there and take some questions. Thank you.
Thanks, Ben. Excellent as always. I'm always fascinated by your charts and graphs. Yesterday, you and I had a very interesting meeting with one of the senior guys at Lenovo. And he made some interesting statements, didn't he, about this point, about which China. Because he said that even at Lenovo, they split China into the emerging China and the, what was the phrase he used?
Mature.
The mature China. So I thought that was really interesting, wasn't it? Any other insights? I mean, you and I were in that meeting together.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it'll result in the fact that multinationals in particular will start to have differentiated sales strategies as they sell low-cost product into certain parts or the less developed parts of China and the high-cost product into the more developed parts of China, the sort of product that they're selling into London or New York. But I think it becomes important in terms of there are going to be a lot of local governments that will struggle to raise cash over the coming few years. And those governments that are especially leveraged are perhaps going to be reluctant to offer policy incentives, may even reverse the policy incentives that they'd offered to factories to move into their part of the region. And so I think there's some questions that we need to ask as we look to tie up suppliers that are perhaps further inland. We really need to think about what is the economic situation of that particular province, but more importantly, that particular municipality. What happens if growth slows to 6%? How does a local government respond to that situation?
And when we were talking to that senior executive at Lenovo yesterday, he also made some interesting observations about that movement from the manufacturing side, moving up the value chain, but he also talked about more R&D now in China and perhaps more services that were moving into China.
Yeah, absolutely, and we are starting to see more investment into research and development. What will be interesting though, and one reason that private firms are making acquisitions of brands and technologies overseas is the shortcut. And that investing in research and development is an expensive process and often only suitable for the biggest multinationals. So making acquisitions is a shortcut, but we may also see, and I think it becomes quite interesting, some of the younger generation who aren't prepared to work in a factory, who do have design skills, simply setting up their own fast fashion operations, designing for a local market, using contract manufacturers and distributing on, say, Tmall. I think H-Style is a great case in point. For those who don't know, here's a Chinese entrepreneur formerly based in Korea. When he returns home, he realizes there's an appetite for Korean fashion, and so sets up his own fast fashion chain, effectively copying the latest Korean fashions, adapting it for the local market, and everything gets sold through either Tmall or through their own corporate website. So I think that will become increasingly important.
Right. I could, of course, talk to you all morning, lots of questions. Anybody with any comments or any questions for Ben? I know it's kind of first thing in the morning. If you don't mind stating, if you can, you're the first one. Can you state your name and the company you represent? It's on, I think. Yeah.
Okay. Good morning, Maximilian Kleist, Schitte company. We are in sourcing, or active in sourcing, mainly from China, as most of the people here. I think you've been talking about labor shortages. Do you have any studies or charts or anything you could share regarding the areas which will be mainly affected by the labor shortage? Is it mainly the south or Zhejiang, or is it going to be the north or west?
And again, I think what will be critical is the slowdown in growth to 6%. So the government is increasingly debt constrained, investment spending has pulled back. Part of the reason for these labor shortages, there have been job opportunities in province that typically export labor. There are now restraints on that spending. So you might find that migrant workers who once had opportunities to stay at home at decent paying jobs now start to look for opportunities again along the eastern seaboard. It won't be a dramatic change because, again, I think the decline in the youth labor market is so serious that perhaps this will just provide a marginal return of labor to the more traditional provinces. But again, I think it's that differentiation in growth between municipalities, between provinces, which will be key and could have a significant impact on the way labor is distributed across the country.
Thanks, Ben. Any other comments or questions for Ben? Audience very quiet this morning, Ben. Very quiet. Ben, just in terms, a sneak preview of the rise of the New East. What are the key drivers?
So again, the fact is the region is growing, but growing in complexity. And we have multinationals coming to us saying, you know, the opportunities to make money are greater than ever, but it's harder than ever to actually make money. And what you're finding is that the multinationals across most industries are having to balance what is a global brand with local insights. And so how do you manage a global business when you're selling to 45 different mid-sized Indonesian cities? each of which have their own peculiar characteristics. And at the same time, you're running up against local competitors who are increasingly sophisticated. And I think A-Style is a great case in point. Cloud servers, the growth of e-commerce all make it easier for people that we perhaps once employed to set up their own companies and to produce increasingly sophisticated products that then ultimately start to compete with our own businesses. So it's balancing those global brands with local insights that is increasingly complex for those of us who've been in the industry for a while.
Okay. Now, the million-dollar question, are you planning to leave China anytime soon? Should we be leaving with you, or are you staying?
I'm here.
So you're staying?
I absolutely. I think for those of us who've been, the easy money is about to leave. China is about to get vastly more complex, but there are going to be some fantastic opportunities to make money. We just have to be smarter than we were before. And so those of us who've been in the industry for some time and have seen these changes evolve, now is a great opportunity.
The easy money is about to leave, quote, Ben Simpfendorfer. I actually love the quote, balance a global brand with local insights. Because I think that's very true, isn't it? You can't take that cookie-cutting approach anymore.
Honeywell is a great example of that. Honeywell have 1,200 engineers in Pudong. And they are now re-engineering their products and benchmarking themselves against their Chinese competitors. So they're providing low cost but high quality. And more importantly, they're now actually competing with other parts of Honeywell. So Honeywell China is going to Turkey and competing with Honeywell Europe for the sale of its products. So it's providing the same product, but a low cost but high quality version of the same product. So it's that maintenance of a global brand but internal competition that I think they're getting right, but is tough for a lot of multinational firms.
Mm-hmm. Now, we talked about multinational firms. The one thing that perhaps you touched on a little bit was, of course, the rise of a lot more local competition as well. I mean, we are seeing increased local competition. Is that something that we need to be aware of?
Yeah, absolutely. I know I sat on a panel session last year where we looked into this subject. And it's not easy to make the transition from manufacturer to brand owner. But again, the introduction of cloud servers has made, cloud computing has made that transition easier than in the past. The ability to buy in skilled labor from overseas or afford skilled labor from overseas to help you design new products, to market new products is greater than ever. So without a doubt that the rise of the regional MNC will be one of the next big changes, and certainly something that we need to keep an eye out for.
Right. And in fact, when we spoke to Lenovo yesterday, and just harping back to Lenovo, but the interesting thing I think for you and I was that, you know, here was a true multinational in the sense of a Chinese company that's of course grown, developed, acquired, but you and I think, got the same sense that they're really, truly international. 60 senior members in their management team, 27 different nationalities.
Absolutely. And the fact that you're based in the region, the fact you can tap into Asia's massive spending power will be important. I mean, SF Express is a great example. The big global 3PL operators are competitive internationally. They're okay regionally. They struggle to compete in China. Zhou Daifuk is another terrific example. 1,800 stores in China. They have more stores in China than they do than Tiffany's has globally. At some point, this is a company that will start to make acquisitions and use its scale to build out a global platform and develop new brands. These are some real threats that I don't think all multinationals and certainly mid-sized firms in Europe, the United States are ready for.
Yeah, absolutely. Ladies and gentlemen, before we wrap up, I'm not too sure if there's any final comments or any burning question. Oh, we've got a question at the back. Is that Shirley?
Yes.
Hello, Shirley.
Ben, you mentioned earlier on about the shift of China moving some of looking market share and go to some of the other smaller country, but they are capacity-wise still quite small. And India is one that's supposed to have much bigger capacity. Do you see India picking up, changing regulation to accommodate more market share?
I think there are a fair number of people in the room who probably have some really direct experience of this. And but I'm regularly in India, and do talk, speaking to smart people on the subject. And again, it all comes down to similar issues that are faced in sub-Saharan Africa that relate to less so inputs, but more logistics, industrial land. These are all major restraints. And the levels of corruption are, to say the least, phenomenal. And they do make business difficult.
And also the other way around is China gaining market share, but primarily on the electronics. But do you see, because of some other issues, that China gaining other market share back by putting better on some of those other cities that was not well developed?
I think China, whatever market share China has lost, it will probably struggle to get back. But I do think it will increasingly serve or supply its own markets. So I think the growth of domestic sort of fast fashion brands becomes quite interesting. And so maybe it will pick up. We're only talking small amounts of market share, but it will retain more labor-intensive processing work than we expect, primarily because of that fast fashion industry and the use of online commerce to supply local consumers.
Okay. Well, ladies and gentlemen, I think you'll agree. Some fascinating insights there from Ben Simpfendorfer. He's around. You're hanging around today. So if you want to grab him at the coffee break, have a chat. If you have a question, another burning question you want to ask him, sure, he'll only be too happy to talk to you. So please thank Mr. Ben Simpfendorfer. Ben, cheers, mate.